Isha.
Welcome and good afternoon. I'm Sally Logan Walker, and I serve here at Roanoke College as the Director of Alumni and Donor Relations. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this NOKELive event. The NOKELive series was created this past summer by the Roanoke College Alumni Association, and to date we have produced 21 events on a myriad of topics ranging from film and book reviews to webinars on COVID, the economy, politics, and more. It is my pleasure to be here to welcome you to today's NOKELive event. Before we get started, please know that each of you with us today from watching on YouTube can use the chat feature to ask questions of our two speakers today, and we will attempt to answer as many of your questions as possible. Today's event is being recorded and will be available on this YouTube channel for future viewing. A link to all past NOKELive events, as well as other online content, can be found on the Alumni Hub at roanoke.edu/alumni. So now I'd like to introduce our two guests. We are joined by Dr. Todd Peppers and Miss Becca Carey. Todd Peppers is the Henry H. and Trudy H. Fowler Professor of Public Affairs here at Roanoke College. His research and teaching interests focus on the Supreme Court, judicial institutions, civil liberties, and the death penalty. He attended Washington and Lee University, then the University of Virginia School of Law, followed by Emory University, where he obtained a doctorate in political science. In addition to numerous publications, Dr. Peppers has most recently concluded his trilogy of books on influential judges through the eyes of their clerks with his new book of Courtiers and Princes, drawing on contributions from former law clerks and judicial scholars, including an essay by the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. This book provides an inside look at the professional and personal bonds that form between lower court judges and their clerks. Becca Carey graduated from Roanoke College in 2018 with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Sciences and Criminal Justice. After graduation, she spent almost a year working in the United States Attorney's Office in Roanoke in their asset forfeiture section before enrolling at Harvard Law School. She is currently on leave from Harvard due to the pandemic and is spending her year off both as a legal fellow for the Human Trafficking Legal Center and one of the Supreme Court co-chairs on the Harvard Law Review. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to our guests, Becca Carey and Dr. Todd Peppers.
Thank you so much, Sally. I really appreciate that introduction. And thanks everyone for joining us. I guess I will get us kicked off with just sort of some more general questions. Dr. Peppers, how did you get interested in the topic of law clerks? I know when I started researching for you that it wasn't, a topic that I was particularly familiar with, and I don't think many people are. And so would you tell us a little bit about how you got interested?
Sure. And first, a disclaimer. As your professor, I'm used to asking the questions and you answering them. This is a nice role reversal. So I attended law school, and during the second year of law school, I had a vague sense that I wanted to be a litigator. I wanted to be in the courtroom. And I was told by a law school advisor that many law students who want to be in the courtroom, before they start their careers with a law firm, et cetera, that they would clerk. They would work as a law clerk in the federal court system. So I did that for the 2 years after law school. I clerked for a federal district court judge out in Omaha, Nebraska, and then for a federal magistrate judge in Roanoke. And in both those instances, I worked in buildings where there were multiple judges and multiple law clerks. All federal judges have at least one, if not two, law clerks. And I sort of became interested in how these clerkship experiences varied. The mentoring relationships that some clerks did and some clerks did not have, how the clerks were utilized in terms of how much duties or responsibilities they were given. Because when I went to law school and we talked about judicial decision making, we never talked about law clerks as being part of the equation. So I went to grad school. You have the dreaded dissertation you have to write to end up your PhD program. And after talking through a range of topics with my dissertation advisor, I decided I wanted to go ahead and to try to write a dissertation and the sort of over time how justices on the Supreme Court have hired, selected, and utilized their clerks. I say try because my dissertation advisor was skeptical because there's a law clerk duty of confidentiality, which extends beyond the clerkship and even beyond the death of the justice. And a major component of my proposed dissertation was doing a survey of former law clerks. And so we said, let's try it. So I sent out 2,000 surveys and I got a 30% response rate, which I was stunned by, and my dissertation advisor was stunned by. And I went ahead and wrote the dissertation, and that sort of began this journey of exploring all things law clerks.
That's really helpful. I think I've heard that story before, but it's astounding that you got 30%.
Yes.
Now that I know a little bit more about clerking and that world, that's truly incredible. So I guess, so you started with your dissertation, and now you have a trilogy of books. So how did you go from a dissertation to this particular trilogy?
Well, for anyone in the audience who's been through, a graduate school program, you end up writing a thesis or a dissertation. And if you want to be an academic, you want to just not write that dissertation and leave it sitting there. You want to do something with it. So my dissertation committee did me sort of a profound favor, and they encouraged me and helped me write the dissertation in a way that it could be easily translated into a book. All you had to do was take out the literature review section, put something else in, and bang. So the dissertation turned into a book, which was just a book on, again, hiring and utilization of law clerks, lots of stories. One thing that really I find interesting is the human relationships, the bonds that form between judges and their clerks. I had one judge who didn't particularly like me, and there was tension in the relationship. And I had a second judge who was a real mentor and friend. And I thought in some ways that was the most valuable part of a clerkship, is having a mentor or a friend. And so when I wrote this first book, I focused not only on how law clerks are selected and what do they do, but also some of these personal bonds. So that was the first book. And then the collection, the 3-volume set of essays with UVA Press, are collections of essays written by former law clerks about their experiences. And again, I was just sort of astonished because, maybe not astonished is the right word, there is this ongoing duty of confidentiality. And some law clerks interpret it so broadly that if you ask, does your justice eat yogurt for lunch? They would say, that's confidential. But enough felt like they could talk about their experiences in general and the sort of the human interest stories. And so that's where these 3 volumes of essays came from. The first 2 were law clerks talking about their experiences at the United States Supreme Court. And as a law student, Becca, sometimes we make the mistake of thinking the only court that's worth studying is this, the big court in the sky. And so the 3rd volume was supposed to rectify that obsession with the Supreme Court by looking at law clerks who clerked for what I call lower federal court judges, so district courts, courts of appeal, or state court judges. And so really the 3 volumes of essays are just trying to understand more about what I think is an important part of the federal and state courts.
Yeah, I think that last point is really important. My co-chair and I, who are the Supreme Court co-chairs on the law review, have had a lot of discussions lately because, in our title, it's Supreme Court. So we can't just say, we don't care about the Supreme Court anymore. We want to look more into lower courts. But really there is this tension of, at the end of the day, there are a ton of cases that come out of the Supreme Court that have impacts for, everyday people's lives, but there's about 80 of those cases and not all of them have, everyday impacts on people's lives, but there are a lot of other cases that do from state courts and from lower courts. And so I really appreciate the sort of broadening of the scope of your research.
Well, as you know, for most people, their day in court begins and ends in a lower court, right?
Right.
We have this romantic idea that if we find that we've been unjustly treated, that we can, loudly proclaim, I'm going to take this case all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And that rarely ever happens. So for most people at a federal district court, that is their day. And what's also, when we do focus on the Supreme Court, when you all solicit articles about judicial behavior in certain judges, in some instances, it should be, a certain judge and his or her law clerks. There are justices who we refer to as writing their opinions with their hands in their pockets because they're not writing. It's the law clerks that are writing, and giving that sort of power to 25, 26-year-olds who are very smart, have good legal training, but maybe are a little green, a little self-impressed, and a little short of wisdom, giving them that sort of power, I think is astonishing. The Supreme Court wants to argue. Supreme Court doesn't like talking about law clerks. And when the justices do talk about law clerks, they talk out of both sides of their mouth. So the late Antonin Scalia one time gave a lecture at American University. And in the same sort of breath, he said, law clerks don't matter, and that he couldn't afford to hire a law clerk from American University because they weren't good enough students. And, it could have an impact on the work of his chambers. Well, which is it? And I do think that some justices are loath to talk about law clerks because the clerks do so much.
Yeah. And I think that is reflected in sort of other factors too. Like the world recognizes that. When you get into law school and you hear about clerking, and then you hear about, the crazy 40 or so that make it to the court every year. One of the things that always comes up is, after the court, you get your $500,000 signing bonus because a firm that has a Supreme Court litigation practice wants to hire you.
Yep.
And so, you do, while there is this sort of confidentiality requirement, there's also this recognition that a lot about the court in a way that no one else really ever will.
And they want you to divulge that, right? They're not giving you that ginormous signing bonus because you're very smart, or not just alone. Clearly, if you're clerking at the Supreme Court, you're bright. But what they want is your expertise, your insight, and understanding how to craft arguments to certain justices. And that's inside knowledge, right? That you don't have unless you clerked at the Supreme Court. And Becca's not exaggerating. The signing bonuses from New York firms, from Washington firms are huge. And also, this is the golden ticket. If you clerk at the United States Supreme Court, the world falls at your feet, and you work at the Department of Justice or the White House, you work at elite law schools in the faculty, or you make more money than God at some New York or Washington or LA law firms. And so, it used to be that law students pursued clerkships because they wanted the experience. But now, if you can wipe out all your law school debt in 6 months' salary or with a bonus, there's other reasons to pursue clerkships than knowledge or experience.
Definitely. I want to pivot for a second. I think, it's been a really sad year for many, many reasons. But one sort of profound reason is the loss of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I think I didn't know much about Ruth Bader Ginsburg until I actually took a class with you freshman year, and I was assigned to read her biography, and I was just astounded. She was such an incredible woman. And I think being at Harvard and now on the Harvard Law Review, which she was one of the first women to be on, it's been so interesting to see, I will never be Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but, to see the parallels and to have the recognition of I wouldn't be living the life that I'm living as a student at Harvard Law and as an editor on the Harvard Law Review, if women like her didn't, pave the way. And there's a bathroom on campus in one of the older buildings that has a plaque outside of it because it was the only building that had a women's restroom. And so in the snow and rain and ice in Cambridge, as you can imagine, the snowy Boston winters, the women would have to run from all over campus to this one bathroom in the basement. And so I have a picture of that I will look at.
Wow.
Yeah, she just left quite a legacy. And so did I think she's the most well-known woman from that era at Harvard, but there were several others who were in her class, and so there have been stories about them as well recently. But anyway, in your newest collection, you have an essay from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and so I'd love to hear some of the behind-the-scenes stories of how that came about.
Well, I tell students the story about how I first met Justice Ginsburg as an example of you take chances in life, especially why not take a chance if you have nothing to lose. So I wrote Justice Ginsburg a letter about 12 years ago, and I asked if I could interview her for an essay I wanted to write in one of my first books on Justice Ginsburg and her law clerks. And she wrote me back and she said, well, I have to take Justice Brandeis's advice about resisting the irresistible, and I have to say no. So I wrote her again. A year later, asked her if she was still resisting the irresistible, and I wrote her again. And finally, she granted me an interview. And I got to go up to the Supreme Court, and I was only supposed to be an hour, and I got an hour and a half with her in her chambers. And we ended it, and then she went upstairs to the gym to do the elliptical. And I got to do an interview with her that I turned into an article. And then I kept writing her. And once every 6 months, I just write her. And she'd write back, which sort of astonished me. And so I got to know her. And when this book project, the one we're talking about today, I was putting together 4 years ago, I wrote her and I said, I'm collecting essays written by people who clerked for lower court judges. And Justice Ginsburg, when she graduated from Columbia Law School, had few job prospects. She was a woman, she was Jewish, and she was a mother. And that was a hard sell in the 1950s. But there was a federal district court judge in New York. His name was Edmund Palmieri. And he gave her a clerkship, and she clerked for him for 2 years. And this is the late 1950s. And so I asked Justice Ginsburg if she would write an essay. And at first, her response was, I don't have time. But then she volunteered to send me some comments that she had prepared for Justice Palmieri's memorial service that she was unable to deliver because her flight was a tornado and she couldn't get there. And so I said, sure. And she said, well, this is about it, Todd. I can't, I'm just too busy. But then I wrote her again and I said, can I just ask 3 more questions about your essay? And then I wrote her again and asked for 5 more questions. And so ultimately what started off as just a reprint for the first time, so a printing of her memorial comments, turned into a full-blown essay. And one of the things I have in my desk drawer, which was sort of, I'll keep for the rest of my life, is the last version of the essay I sent her. And she sent it back to me with the hard text, and comments and corrections are made in her own hand. So Justice Ginsburg was proofreading my work, which is, pretty cool as an academic. And it's an incredibly important story because, as you say, we're just like one generation removed from, women being told they shouldn't be at law school. I mean, that was what Justice Ginsburg was told when she was in her first year at Harvard Law School. She was asked by the dean of the law school, how do you feel taking the spot of a well-qualified man? And then, women who, once they got out of law school, Sandra Day O'Connor's first job was a legal secretary because she couldn't get a job. Justice Ginsburg finally found a clerkship, but even after that, her options were limited. So I wanted people to talk about unique experiences, and certainly her essay was wonderful in talking about a time period where a woman in a judicial chamber was almost unheard of.
Yeah, I think that is incredibly important. And like you said, it's, we're 1-2 generations removed from that. And I think that's something that's sort of unbelievable. I mean, so my incoming class at Harvard Law was the second only to have majority women. And so, we've made a lot of progress, but we have a long way to go. So I actually have a question from the audience now.
Okay,
So the first question is, what were some of the most surprising stories you found during your research? I think I will also add a caveat, either in print, or I think in your sort of intro to the book, you talk about how a lot of clerks were not willing to go written on the record about some of their experiences.
I guess a surprising non-story was there was a particular Court of Appeals judge who was supposed to be a disaster, and law clerks loved telling stories about her behind her back. But when I ended up writing 25 of them, to see if they'd write an essay, suddenly their courage dissipated, because I didn't want this to be a book about every person, every judge in the book is a marble statue, is some sort of demigod who never makes mistakes. That's not true, and it's not interesting. But sometimes it was a struggle to get law clerks to sort of, I think, do anything except lionize their judge or their justice. One surprising story came from Polly Craighill. Polly was a law clerk to the first female federal district court judge. Her name was Bernita Sheldon Matthews, and she was appointed by Harry Truman. And Polly is one of the two last surviving law clerks. And I was asking her about how the judge selected law clerks, and Polly said that the judge never hired male law clerks, which, for someone who, is breaking the glass ceiling but knows what gender discrimination is like, sort of surprised me. And I said, why? And she said, because the judge, very conscious of gender discrimination, this is a judge who was a contemporary and friend of Amelia Earhart, was a suffragette. The judge did not want people saying that men were running her chambers by having male law clerks. I don't know if it's surprising because I knew the story, but one of the more poignant stories is by a gentleman named Ron Johnson. He clerked for a federal district court judge named John Wood, and his judge was assassinated during his clerkship. His judge was a judge down in Texas. The war on drugs was heating up. His judge was sentencing a lot of drug runners to long terms in jail. And the drug cartel hired an assassin who turned out later to be the father of actor Woody Harrelson. And the hitman killed the judge, shot him in his driveway one morning. And this is still so fresh that even 40 years later, Ron can't talk about it without crying. But of all the experiences of a law clerk, to talk about being a pallbearer at your judge's funeral because he's been, one of the only 3 federal judges who's ever been killed, perhaps not surprising, but certainly, poignant in terms of a story.
Yeah, I think one thing that has really struck me as I've learned more about clerks is, you really, I think in many chambers become part of the family. I mean, the judges are seeing you more than they're seeing their own family. I mean, being a judge, it's no joke. I mean, it's certainly a sweet gig in many ways, but it's a lot of work, and you're in your chambers all the time, and there's a lot to do. And there's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot of, contentious issues that are going to come before you. And, back to your sort of conversation earlier about the hiring process, I think so much of figuring out who to hire is like, yes, do they have the qualifications, but is this somebody that I want to spend, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, however many hours a week just being around and having in chambers. And I think that that's been a really interesting question in the context of the pandemic. I mean, I'm now in law school, and I have friends and myself who are looking into clerking. And, there's this question of like, how are judges going to hire people? Because usually it's a whole big, long shebang process. You go and the clerks like interview you in this very intense way, and the judge meets you. And so I think that that's something that has been really like interesting to me, is learning how much you basically just become part of the family in many of these relationships.
So a federal court of appeals judge named Patricia Wald once said, outside of marriage and parenthood, the judge-clerkship relationship is one of the more intimate human relationships because you are in chambers 12 hours a day for a year or 2 years. And it's funny, we talk about chamber fit. One trick that Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to do, so if you were a finalist for a clerkship position, you went to Washington, D.C. to interview with the justice. And when you got there, you were told by the secretary, the justice is running behind. Will you please have a seat? It's going to be a little while. But really what was going on was the secretaries were screening the law clerks because they would ask questions of the applicants, because Ginsburg said, if they can't work with my secretaries, they're not going to work for me. So, the justices or the judges appreciate that you're bringing someone into a small sort of chambers family for a long period of time, and personality fit is just as important as whether, you have brain cells and you're a legal scholar. And I think sometimes young law students, who, as you know, Becca, many law students don't suffer from a lack of self-regard or ego, I think some applicants would be best remember that they're also being judged by whether someone wants to be around them or not for a year.
Yeah, I am one of my 1L professors actually lived with Chief Justice Roberts in law school and then after law school. And so he has many, many stories about clerks, and he's sort of a professor that will write a lot of recommendations. And I remember the very first day of orientation when he was talking about a whole bunch of things, he was like trying to remind us not to get too big of a head, and that, you know, at the end of the day, the support staff and those that you're working with that may not be the like most important people in the sort of elite academic law space, you know, be nice to them because it matters. And how, you know, there are instances of hiring related to clerking where, you know, somebody had dropped a pencil, did somebody pick it up, you know, like was somebody nice to the legal secretaries. And so I think that is very true.
Important.
Yeah. All right. I have another question from the audience.
Sure.
So can you explain a little bit more about what a law clerk is and what they do and how they are different from, say, like a paralegal?
Sure. The paralegals you typically see in law firms. Maybe 25 years ago, paralegals might not have a 4-year degree. Now they do. And paralegals are sort of assistants to attorneys. And paralegals can't practice law, and sometimes there's a fine line between being a paralegal and practicing law. They'll manage cases, keep the calendar, edit documents, etc. Law clerks, first law clerk was at the Supreme Court in 1884, but now judges across the federal and state courts have law clerks, are graduates of law school, typically have already taken the bar, with some exceptions. And they are doing, they're practicing law, they're doing the substantive work of the chambers. So for example, if there's a motion filed by a party to exclude evidence, most likely the law clerk's going to review the motion and the supporting materials and either draft an order for the judge or at least sit down with the judge and make a recommended disposition. Today at the Supreme Court, there is no justice who prepares the first draft of his or her own opinion. The last person who sat down and wrote his own opinions out by hand was 90-year-old John Paul Stevens. Now, the law clerks sit down with the justices. They may get detailed instructions, but it's law clerks who prepare the first draft of opinions, and then they're edited and revised, and the judges aren't giving up control. But that's a lot of responsibility, because you as a law clerk may be making decisions about what precedent is important, how to interpret it, how to apply tests. So law clerks today across the courts do help prepare the substantive legal work of the judges. Now, one reason why I wanted to be on the federal district court is those are the trial courts. So I got to sit in on trials, and the judge may have questions about pending motions during breaks I had to research, but I got to see attorneys in action. And one reason why I tell our own college students, I want them to do internships before law school where they get in the courtroom, because until you go in the courtroom, you think that being a lawyer must be like designing a rocket ship. You have to be a nuclear physicist or something. But then you go in the courtroom and you see that half the lawyers, you could already do a better job then, right? And you saw that, Becca. And suddenly it's not quite so mysterious, and it helps your confidence to see that there's variation in legal skill and oral advocacy in a courtroom. So for district court judges, law clerks will be in the courtroom as well, participating in sentencing hearings. And you as a clerk, you take it seriously. The last week I was a law clerk out in Omaha, Nebraska. I sat in on the sentencing of a young man who was a year younger than I am at that time, who was getting ready to be sentenced to 40 years in prison with no parole for possession with intent to distribute crack cocaine. And I think about him from time to time because it's been a long time since I've been a law clerk, but he's still in federal prison. And that is, I think, it's good for you to remember how important the work you're doing is, how consequential it is as well. You just can't get, always in this cool, I'm drafting orders. You have to appreciate the seriousness of your work.
Yeah, I think that is something that sort of draws me to law generally is I'm sure you can do law that is not particularly consequential, but there's a reason why people don't particularly like lawyers. I think there's many reasons why people don't particularly like lawyers, but
Let's
one of them is, you don't go to a lawyer generally when you're at your best. It's a time when if you're calling a lawyer, your life's probably not going particularly great and could be one of the lowest points. And so, you're going to a lawyer about a criminal proceeding, or you're getting sued, or you're suing someone, or you're getting a divorce, or there's custody issues, or, there's a million reasons why you would go and see a lawyer. And some of them are positive. Maybe you're starting a new business and you need some advice from a lawyer to help you get on your feet. But a lot of times when you're working as a lawyer, especially if you're working with clients, like, it's going to have a real impact on their life. And I think that's important to sort of keep that front of mind. And I think
what I used to tell you, and I tell other pre-law students at Roanoke College, is a law degree is a powerful tool. And it's a powerful tool to affect social change. Think of all the issues of the 20th century and the first 20 years of the 21st century that have been resolved by the courts. And it's also a valuable tool to be a voice for the voiceless, to help people who, and I also told you guys, you can be a social engineer or you can be a social parasite. You can enrich yourself with the law degree, but you can maybe do both, at the same time. But it is a powerful and flexible tool, and you are called to be people's champions. So it's easy to tell lawyer jokes when you don't need a lawyer, but when you need someone to be your champion, suddenly your attitude changes a little bit.
Yeah. And I think it's so true. A law degree really is to some extent a superpower. I mean, there's stories of friends of mine who, are in law school and just having like JD candidate after their name, they can write a letter, they can make a call for friends who are dealing with landlord tenant issues, or even as a law student, you have that. And then all the more as a lawyer, just having a law degree and some letterhead, you can make headway when average people can't, with a phone call or a letter, and that's really impactful.
Yeah, it is.
So great. We have another question. Did you find any judge-law clerk relationships that were more tenuous than one would expect? And what were those relationships like, and how was that clerking experience?
So in the first of the 3 volumes of essays, I think it's the first one, we have a story about Justice William O. Douglas and his law clerks. William O. Douglas, a New Dealer, head of the SEC. Roosevelt put him on the court in the late 1930s. And he was on the court into the mid 1970s, which is an astonishingly long tenure. Justice Douglas was known for firing his law clerks. Now, it didn't mean anything. The law clerks would get fired and the secretary would tell them, leave for the day and come back tomorrow. But the best story was a law clerk who was getting married on the weekend. And he was getting married and he'd reserved one of the courtyards at the Supreme Court. And he was a Douglas law clerk and he'd invited Justice Douglas to his wedding. So the wedding was on a Saturday. On Friday, Justice Douglas had a temper tantrum, fired the law clerk and stormed out. And the law clerk was saying to himself, what am I supposed to do? I have the courtyard because Justice Douglas reserved it for me and he's one of the guests. The secretary says, don't worry about it, hold your wedding. And Justice Douglas showed up the next day and acted like nothing was wrong, patted him on the back and congratulated him, was in all smiles. But that is hard. If you're a young person, you think that this is the single most important job you'll ever have and it's going to open doors. And then your justice has a temper tantrum. The one time Justice Douglas called one of his law clerks into his chambers and pointed to a book. And he said, did you handle this book? Because the pages are bent. And the law clerk said, no, Mr. Justice. And Douglas goes, I revere books. You need to take care of books. Douglas took the book then and flipped it. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to flip it onto a book cart that was there. Douglas missed the book cart. The book went flying out the window and then landed with a crack on the pavement below. And the law clerk just had to keep their face perfectly still and then sort of back out of the chambers. Douglas had a buzzer that he used to call his law clerks. And the clerks were sort of like, was it Pavlov's dog? You'd hear the buzzer and the dogs would start drooling. The law clerks would start trembling. And at Douglas's funeral, one of the former law clerks was standing before his casket and had this overpowering urge to open it up to see if the buzzer was in there. He didn't. But yeah, I mean, these are intimate, close relationships, but they can be extraordinarily dysfunctional or stressful. and they extend beyond the clerkship. Felix Frankfurter, a Supreme Court justice, hated it when his law clerks, quote unquote, sold out and went to work for big New York or Washington law firms. And what Frankfurter would do years after they were his clerks would call them up and tell them to do a research assignment. Then they're not his clerks anymore. He's a justice, but they're lawyers. And he'd say, well, this is your penitence for selling out to big law, is you're going to continue doing pro bono research for me. And the law clerks did so because Felix told them to. So yeah, there are relationships that are fraught with difficulty, and probably William O. Douglas is the best example.
Yeah, that's I feel like there's a lot of stress in all of our lives right now, but that's a whole other level.
Well,
I can't imagine.
If you are fired as a law clerk, that may ruin your subsequent employment plans. That's a dark stain on your resume. And you're in a relationship where it's completely, the power arrangement, is skewed. The first week I clerked for a judge out in Omaha, I didn't know what a very obscure legal term was called statute of repose. I knew what statutes of limitations were. My judge asked me a question about statute of repose. And I said, well, Judge, I don't know. I'll have to go look it up. And he said to me, Todd, did you go to school? Did you go to law school in the gutter? And what do you say as a law clerk? Thank you, Judge. May I have another? And just, sort of slink out. It can be a wonderful relationship, but you can also feel sometimes at the mercy of a judge who's having a temper tantrum.
Yeah. I think sort of another question somewhat related from the audience is sort of who is the judge and or law clerk you most wish you could have met, and why?
Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., the great dissenter, the magnificent Yankee. Holmes was a Harvard Law School graduate, fought in the Civil War, wounded 3 times, left for dead on the battlefield at Antietam, became a author, law professor, and then ultimately at the relatively advanced age of 60 was elevated to the Supreme Court. Holmes had law clerks, and they did some work for him, but mainly they were his intellectual companions. They would go around Washington, D.C. with him, looking at the sites while being quizzed by him about different intellectual or philosophical questions. One time, Holmes found out that one of his law clerks had never read the Old Testament. So the law clerk's job assignment was to read the Old Testament. And then when he got done with it, the judge would quiz him about it. He was a man who sort of loved life and passed on that love of life to his law clerks. I mean, when he was in his 80s, his law clerks would be out with him cringing as the justice was climbing down rocks at Rock Creek Parkway because the judge wanted to pick flowers or the bloodroot that was blooming in March for his wife. You can imagine how you feel as a law clerk if your justice does a tumble into the river. So I think Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., he was childless. And so in some ways, his law clerks became his surrogate children for the rest of his life. They looked out for him and his wife and kept in touch with them. There's other justices who had a real zest for life, who took their mentorship of their law clerks seriously, who remained present in their life. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a whole box of onesies in her chamber, and printed on it was RGB Grand Clerk. So when her law clerks had children, those went out in the mail to them. So because they were part of the RGB's collective law clerk family. So probably Holmes, maybe Hugo Black. Hugo Black's law clerks were so close to him that when Hugo Black's first wife died suddenly in the 1940s, the law clerks moved in with him for a couple of years to take care of him. And they get a knock in the morning and go down in their jammies to have breakfast with the justice. At night, the justice will cook them steaks, and then they go out and play tennis. And then they go up to the justice's office and talk about Thomas Jefferson and the Greeks and history. And it was, again, transformative experience. You're just not learning about the law, you're learning about life. So that's who I'd like to clerk for, but in my dreams.
Yeah, those are some pretty great options. I guess I want to loop back around and sort of connect some threads from earlier conversation. which, we've talked a little bit about how we don't necessarily, it's hard to find that balance of not idolizing judges and justices, and how the sort of duty of confidentiality plays into that and makes that difficult. We've also talked about a little bit about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the shattering of glass ceilings and other clerks and judges who did that. And there's been some sort of recent headlines, less recent now, but there's always a few about sort of misconduct that happens in judges' chambers. And I think, you allude to some of this in the intro of your book of how when you're not honest about the clerking experience and when you're not, when that's information that because of confidentiality reasons, or perhaps because of sort of self-interest of if your judge falls from grace and that was sort of your ticket, you have all of these very well-respected judges that people clerk for, and that mentorship is supposed to last for many, many years and is supposed to sort of help you in your later career. I think we've talked before about how as a judge you like having clerks that can go off and do incredible things, because that you get some benefit from that by having your clerks succeed. And so there are a lot of really interesting dynamics at play between the confidentiality and the self-interest and the power dynamics, like you said earlier. And so any thoughts on like how, I think reaching out to clerks and these books are certainly one way to try to be a little bit more honest and have discussions about these relationships and clerking as an experience generally. But how as a profession do we move forward in ways that are healthy and helpful for clerks?
Well, think about it this way. Let's say you have on your resume that you clerked for Justice so-and-so, and having that on your resume opens doors for you. But of that Justice so-and-so engaged in some sort of misconduct when you were a law clerk, or you've heard rumors that since you were a law clerk, Justice so-and-so is engaged in misconduct. Now, you have a very selfish motivation for not disclosing that, because if your justice has turned out to be some sort of abusive predator, that devalues that line in your resume, right? And justices expect their law clerks to go out and burnish their reputations, because the greater the judge or justice, the greater that line is on your resume. And several years ago, there was a judge out in the Ninth Circuit, Alex Kaczynski, very, very well-known judge, including being what we call a feeder court judge. A lot of his law clerks went on to the Supreme Court. And it turned out that there was some impropriety in his chambers regarding how he interacted with young women, what he said, what he joked about, etc. Ultimately, this came out, but then there was a debate because inside his law clerk family, this was known for a long time, but you are motivated not to step forward, because not only can that damage your own reputation, but also you need this judge or justice to continue to be a recommender for you. So if you want to apply for a job 7 years after you clerk for the judge, you call the judge. And if you have fallen out of disfavor with that judge, you're not going to get that letter. So after the Kaczynski scandal, there have been former law clerks who have wanted to sort of strengthen the ethical code of conduct, which applies to judges, to deal with some of these issues, perhaps address how confidentiality does not extend to sort of abusive behavior. What's really interesting right now is the Supreme Court came up during the presidential election. And one of the big issues was, should we pack the Supreme Court? Should we expand it? And President Biden, then candidate Biden, said if he was elected, he'd create a bipartisan commission to study court reform. And he's doing that now. One thing that commission is going to consider is that the United States Supreme Court justices are not bound by any ethical code of conduct. Every other type of judge in the country has an ethical code of conduct that they are required to follow, or it's highly suggested they follow. The Supreme Court doesn't have that code of conduct. And the justices say, well, we know what we're doing and we can hold ourselves out. If we have a question, we can consult these codes. But yeah, you talk about a power relationship, and then you talk about a power relationship in which there's no judicial code of conduct or ethics. Well, you are setting things up for, potential abuse. And that is troubling. And so I do think on multiple fronts, there's discussions about this disparate power relationship and duty of confidentiality and reporting judicial misconduct. But it's very hard as a 24 or 25-year-old to push back.
Yeah. And I think sort of another angle at which this is really difficult is we've talked a lot about the relationship between the judge or justice and the clerk, but less so about the clerks amongst themselves. And I think that when you are added to the judges or justices family, part of that family is the rest of the clerks that you are sort of working with during your term, which you'll obviously probably be most close with, but then all the sort of clerks before and after, because you have this sort of shared experience and you know all of their sort of idiosyncrasies, and you just like you spend a year or two in these really intense situations, and so to the extent that if there are concerns for you to bring it out, it not only hurts you, but it also presumably will hurt everyone else who's in that clerk family. And that is also, I would imagine, quite an intense.
Coercive, yeah.
Yeah.
Now there's a question which just popped up, which is for you.
Yes.
Which is, do you believe, or how do you think that Roanoke College prepared you for studying law at one of the oldest and most prestigious law schools in the country? We say Harvard, you all say Harvard. So how would you answer that question? Did it? And if so, how?
Absolutely. I think, when I first got in, I would imagine this would hopefully be true of everyone who is going to Harvard. If not, maybe they need to do some soul searching. But, there's a little bit of imposter syndrome of, what am I doing? There's a handful of us that get this opportunity. Like, who am I to be at Harvard Law School? And, I think that was true for the first couple of weeks and months. And then I sort of got into a groove and I realized that, I did deserve to be there. And I, worked really hard. And I think a lot of that came from my experience as an undergrad. I mean, there's so many, but to be able to do research from day one of starting undergrad, I mean, that's huge. And it's unheard of at so many institutions. And so to have 4 years of research experience, because I've continued working and researching with Dr. Peppers after graduation, is just huge. And then, that research experience helped get me an internship at the Department of Justice through the LCWS, the Lutheran semester program in Washington. I spent a semester at the Department of Justice, and that was huge. Getting to see the ins and outs of what being a lawyer at the Department of Justice looks like, and sort of making those connections, which then helped me get a job at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Roanoke right after I graduated. And I think having those things on my resume certainly helped in law school, but they also gave me some background for just legal concepts. I think something about that I think we're starting to do slightly better at in the law is it really is sort of an elitist institution that has a lot of words and phrases and Latin that just is incomprehensible to the average person. So having exposure to a lot of that through my research and through my work opportunities and internship opportunities sort of gave me a leg up. When I was reading cases, I had a sense of, what these words and terms meant and how different courts functioned, because I had been behind the scenes at some of them. And I think lastly, a huge thing is just the community at Roanoke. I very much loved that it wasn't a zero-sum game place. It wasn't a place where I felt like I needed to be particularly competitive with my peers. It was supportive, and it was a community, and it fostered really important discussions. And I think that is not always the case at law school, and in fact is certainly not the norm. And so going in, that was just such a strong belief that I had, is that I don't need to play the competitive game. And I think some people looked at me and were probably like, all right, well, you can do that, but you're not going to get anywhere. And first semester grades came out and I had done just fine. And then, after my first year, was able to get on law review, which I still pinch myself about, which, is one of those other resume lines that will follow me for the rest of my life. And, there's imposter syndrome there too, but I think it very much, I appreciate both the academic rigor of Roanoke and the opportunities it presented that sort of built on that academic rigor, and then just how it shaped me as a person. I think sometimes we underestimate how much, you know, the environment you're in for your 18 to 22 years really forms you as a person. And so sort of the like collaborative community-based ethos that I think I felt so strongly at Roanoke has followed me and served me quite well.
Well, and I know we have to wrap up, but you know, I sometimes refer to Becca behind her back as sort of the poster child for whole person development, or why you go to a liberal arts college. Is Becca constantly took advantage of wonderful opportunities. Becca went to Washington, D.C. for a semester, and every day as a young person walked into the Department of Justice. Becca also spent a semester in Belgium, right? Was it Brussels?
Yes.
Becca was involved in social organizations and religious organizations on campus. She went to speaker events, and she suffered through being my research assistant for 4 years. And this isn't necessarily an up with Becca speech, although it is, but it's also an example of how other students at Roanoke College, the wonderful opportunities we have, sometimes you wish young people would take advantage of more of them, but there are so many things you can do to grow and have new experiences. And you certainly took advantage of all those opportunities. And that's partially why you're at Harvard Law School.
Yeah.
So I think we're supposed to wrap up, Becca.
Yes. I guess we'll close with what is this wrap up or one last question? Okay.
How about what is it Sally, is it wrap up?
No, feel free to ask another question.
How about one last question?
One last question.
The
I feel like
audience at home's not groaning.
we'll tie the bow on this. Future plans on Law Clerks. Any next books?
Well, I'm glad you asked.
Research.
Becca and I are working on a project. Becca has held up her end. I've been a bit dilatory on it, but we're going to catch steam again. One thing that Becca and I are looking at is we've talked about this law clerk duty of confidentiality, but the arrow points one way, that the law clerks cannot divulge what they do with the justices or conversations, but the justices can disclose. And Becca spent a fair amount of time in the Library of Congress going through the personal papers of some justices, including Harry Blackmun. And in those personal papers, you can find the notes and the memos and the legal arguments made by former law clerks who went on to very prominent positions in American government and the law. And some of them are federal judges. And what we want to explore is, if you are a law clerk today and you work for a Supreme Court justice and you have grand plans for the future, but you know that what you tell the justice in writing can be discovered. So for example, when Elena Kagan was nominated to the Supreme Court, everyone went to Thurgood Marshall's personal papers, because she was his law clerk, to try to find evidence to use against her. So if you're a law clerk today, do you pull your punches? Do you not give candid advice to your justice in writing, because you're afraid 30 years from now it's going to be used against you? And this isn't a fantasy. William Rehnquist's nomination to the Supreme Court was almost derailed by memos that he wrote to his justice arguing that the case of Plessy versus Ferguson should be affirmed and that Roe v. Wade should come out a different direction. So that's something that Becca and I are working on right now. And this is the fun thing about having students like Becca. As a professor, you get to work on projects with your students. I've worked on projects with all my research assistants. Becca's just in a long line, but we at Roanoke College are very blessed to have bright young students who share our enthusiasms and our research interests. And then we can send them off to the Library of Congress and do all the hard work for us. So that's the future. You're part of it, Becca. So I think that's it, Sally, unless you have anything else to say or add or.
Sure. Well, let me first just thank each of you for spending this time with us today and sharing these amazing stories. Becca, we're so proud of you. You're doing amazing work. I want to remind the audience that Dr. Pepper's book is available for purchase in either print or ebook form. I'm sure you can search quite readily and find it via one of the search engines online. On behalf of Roanoke College, I invite you to join us for our upcoming NOKELive events. We have many more planned throughout the spring and into the summer. We have 2 next week. We have one on the evening of Wednesday, March 10th. It will be the 3rd in a series focusing on healthcare from Washington with insights from those working in Congress. And then on Friday, March 12th at noon, you can join us for a very special NOKELive that is taking a look at the art of your story and why it matters. And trust me, I think it's going to be eye-opening. Just talking to the panelist and planning that particular event already made me think of things in a whole different way. Tonight, the college also is welcoming Pulitzer Prize winning author Jericho Brown for a reading of his work, and invite all of you to participate in that event. For more information, please visit our website at roanoke.edu/alumni, where you can find links to all the upcoming events and even our past NOKELive events. And before we close, I invite all of our alumni to join the college in a very fun-filled, activity-packed virtual alumni weekend, beginning on Thursday, April 15th and going through Saturday, April 17th. Be sure to mark your calendar, as there will be plenty of events and plenty of fun. Until then, thank you so much, and stay